omitted the professor from his title here, so whereas before they were esteemed colleagues, this is now actually a highly esteemed. Most
about 15 minutes into the lecture.
Most honourable colleague, perhaps. Kendrick works on, again, mainly on post-war American phenomenon, the Vietnam War, the space race being two major research interests of his. But as we recurring theme, dragging post-war historians back to an earlier phase to kind of again to provide historical depth to the post-war era. Kendrick is going to provide some detail to one important aspect of America and its American foreign policy and domestic policy, namely science.
Thank you. So, on April 2nd, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson, he addressed the US Congress to ask for a declaration of war against Germany. The conflict, he emphasized, would involve the United States in many months of fiery trial and sacrifice. He said immediate steps were required, not only to put the country in a more thorough state of defense, but also to exert all its power and employ all its resources to bring the government of the German Empire to terms and end the war. The other needs of the nation, he said, were subordinate to the project of organising and mobilising those resources to supply the materials of war. And certainly there were features of the manner in which the United States fought the conflict that conformed to the sort of standards of a total war. There was a kind of infusion of state-directed propaganda. There was the suppression, restriction of dissent. Chris talked about the case of Eugene Debs, the leader of the Socialist Party, when he was in prison. There was state control. Chris also talked about the state control of the transportation network to try and get rid of the kind of log jams in the supply chain that existed in 1917. And there was also state control of food and fuel supplies. And there were lots of other kind of regulatory interventions in the American economy at this time. At the same time, however, Wilson cast the decision to go to war as consistent with the American principle of opposition to what he called selfish and autocratic power. And in many respects, we might see his administration's mobilization of the home front as consciously self-limiting, as careful not to go too far to transgress the boundaries of a kind of small state, a kind of Jeffersonian tradition of a small state, of an American small state, of a limited state. Where it could, the Wilson administration sought to proceed by creating incentives for voluntaristic enlistment in the national cause, rather than through compulsion, through coercion. It sought to regulate rather than take direct control. It was better to encourage and coordinate contributions on the part of civil society, so business, the professions, the press, than to try and take over civil society itself. And so in this lecture, what I want to do is explore the mobilization of American scientific resources by the state during the course of the Great War. And in many ways, the role of science in the conflict did conform to this voluntarist model. With the slight difference that whereas government sort of went out and banged on the door of industry to get industry to come and help, and actually, industry was very keen to help, you actually have scientists having to kind of bang on the door of government to be let in, to be in order to offer their help. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. So scientists definitely wanted a relationship. They wanted a role in the war. But they were also keen that it not result in a structure of political control over scientific inquiry. They hoped instead to create a network through which scientific elites could give advice on the contents of scientific war work. They could mediate the terms on which that work took place. But they didn't want political control of scientific inquiry. And this is not an easy balance to strike, but the effort to strike it during wartime, I think, is quite interesting. Although we often assume that it was the Second World War followed by the Cold War that produced the most significant structural changes in American scientific practice, stimulated a lot of kind of large-scale state sponsorship. The Second World War and the Cold War stimulated a lot of large-scale state sponsorship of scientific research. Think about what was happening in nuclear physics or quantum electronics. These fields that seem very important to the nation's defence at those times. But it's the Great War that occasioned the first major experiment in matching the supply of scientific expertise to the demands of national security. I think you also perhaps say that something like this also happened in the American Civil War to a degree as well. But in terms of the sort of 20th century, a lot of the kind of precedents again are being sort of explored during the Great War. And as we'll see, this was an experiment that yielded some significant wartime successes. Scientists enlisted to the US military services did develop instruments and techniques that helped to hasten the Allied victory, and that encouraged, after the war, new investments in scientific training, facilities, and institutions. But it's also important to recognise that the Great War intruded on practice, on patterns of scientific practice that were already in the process of changing. It's probably fair to say that in the mid-19th century, and for about 3 decades after the American Civil War, the United States still seemed something of a scientific backwater if we compare them to the institutions of learning, particularly in Germany, but also think of Oxford and Cambridge. In most American universities, members of faculty in departments of science were expected to spend the preponderance of their time on teaching and teaching-related activities. And so university laboratories often only possessed equipment that was necessary to allow undergraduates to engage in sort of elemental experiments. There was very little kind of provision for the staff to do high-precision, cutting-edge work of their own. And yes, I did spend some time Googling old laboratories to get some pictures. Only a handful of US institutions offered what might be classed as sort of first-rate doctoral training programs. Many young scientists actually travelled to Europe, or again, to sort of Oxford, Cambridge, or the German research universities in order to undertake their PhDs. There was a national institution, the National Academy of Science, based in Washington, D.C., but it had very little of the kind of reach and status of, for example, the Royal Society in London. It struggled to serve a scientific community that was diffused across a very large territory. Consistent with the utilitarian ethos of the day, which allocated most cultural prestige to the inventors of usable devices, Thomas Edison, most obvious example, and which accepted, this utilitarian ethos accepted the concentration of massive wealth in the hands of ruthless industrialists like Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and Andrew Mellon as the kind of price that you had to pay for economic modernization. American scientists very much kind of borrowed that kind of utilitarian ethos. They showed very little interest in theory. They tended to proceed in these decades through bite-sized increments of observational data. And if you read scientific journals from the 1870s, it's pretty sort of boring, tedious, minuscule stuff that they're dealing with. Very little of it seemed to be very transformative. People were criticizing it at the time for those limits. The US government, for its part, did promote scientific research through a small number of its agencies and bureaus. Think of the US Geological Survey, the Weather Bureau, the Navy Observatory. But if you sort of think about the sort of titles of those agencies, you understand that this is all about practical use. This is all about producing knowledge that's usable knowledge. So the mapping of natural resources by the Geological Survey, the Weather Bureau speaks for itself. The Naval Observatory, of course, is there to aid with navigation. Towards the end of the 19th century, however, there were some changes stirring across the landscape of American science. John spoke about the progressive movement, and the progressive movement, which had a very strong emphasis, so there's this sort of movement for sort of social reform, political reform, and sometimes cultural reform in the late 19th, early 20th century, of which Woodrow Wilson was a part. The progressive movement had a very strong emphasis upon the role to be played by education in developing an ordered and more efficient society. It's no surprise, perhaps one of the most famous progressive presidents, of course, was the president of Princeton University, Woodrow Wilson. And so the progressives emphasized the desirability of universities becoming centers of research as well as centers of teaching, so that students had exposure to the best, most current knowledge. So universities did start insisting, for example, on the PhD. That is a qualification that you gain through direct experience of research. That they started insisting on the PhD being the kind of the requirement for faculty employment. And actually did so a little bit earlier than some British universities. In many ways, the idea of kind of British PhD is a phenomenon of the war itself. It's kind of introduced by Oxford Cambridge, I think, in 1917. And they also so they start insisting upon a PhD, and they also start investing in scientific laboratories. The University of Chicago, incorporated in 1890, was consciously modelled upon German research universities. And that is, it placed a priority on faculty and graduate student research rather than on teaching undergraduates. And as a sort of sign that perhaps American universities were beginning to come of age, the University of Chicago professor Albert Michelson in 1907 was the first American to be awarded the Nobel Prize for Physics for, amongst other things, his development of the interferometer to allow precise measurements of the properties of light. It was also at Chicago that Robert Millikan in 1909 designed an experiment to determine the charge of an electron, which is a measurement of this kind of very fundamental physical constant. And Millikan's work went on to inform a lot of subsequent research into subatomic particles. So there's a desire for greater rigor in scientific research, a sort of sense that the field of science is trying to upgrade its methods. And this desire for greater rigor perhaps inevitably produced greater specialization as well. So you get scientific subfields starting to develop their own publications, starting to develop their own institutions and organizations. So in the field of physics, the journal Physical Review was founded in 1893, followed by the creation of the American Physical Society in 1899. You get a number of industrial corporations. You think about Kodak, for example, in the field of photography, AT&T in the field of telecommunications, General Electric in the field of electrical engineering, DuPont, makers of chemical explosives. All of these corporations are actually starting around this time, in the early 20th century, to set up their own dedicated laboratories. The US government created the National Bureau of Standards to improve the quality and consistency of American goods, another kind of progressive reform. And the National Bureau of Standards was equipped with a laboratory to test materials and measures. Meanwhile, those robber barons that I talked about, those kind of ruthless industrialists, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, these robber barons of the post-Civil War era had sort of changed. They'd sort of transitioned into being the philanthropists of the progressive period. And they made substantial, significant investments. They threw up quite a lot of their largesse, directed it towards scientific research. John D. Rockefeller founded the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research in 1901. Andrew Carnegie, meanwhile, preferred to fund scientific programs that were beyond the kind of resources, the capacity of any university to organize. And the Carnegie Institution of Washington, which takes its money from Andrew Carnegie, facilitated the establishment of the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena, California. This is Carnegie here with George Owen Hale. And remember that name, I'm going to talk about Hale quite a bit in this lecture. But this is the Mount Wilson Observatory, and by about the outbreak of the First World War, it's basically the best observatory in the world. And that's as a result of Carnegie's money. So it was quickly to become the best resourced astronomical facility in the world. Carnegie also funded a number of other scientific institutions, including the somewhat occult-sounding the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism in Washington, D.C. But as I said, Carnegie tended to focus upon funding things that universities were not up to scale and not able to fund. He didn't generally devote a lot of money to sort of funding research in universities. Moreover, the quality of research being conducted in the universities continued to be very patchy. American physicists, for example, were often very ill-informed about the latest theories about things like the structure of the atom, which were very kind of hot topics at this point in European universities. Robert Millikan was a rather rare bright spot in a landscape that, if you compare it with what was happening in Europe, it's bereft of talents like Max Planck, like Niels Bohr or Albert Einstein. These physicists who have a kind of intuitive feel for the sort of spooky mechanics of nature at both its smallest level and its grandest level. At the same time, the reputation of inventors like Edison, practical men, refer to themselves as practical men, work within the culture to stigmatize academic scientists as impractical, as overly specialized, and sort of basically enclosed in their ivory towers doing things that just weren't very useful and completely unintelligible as well. In 1914, a member of the US House of Representatives openly wondered, what is a physicist? I was asked on the floor of the House what in the name of common sense a physicist is, and I couldn't answer. As the United States started to move into a state of military preparedness from 1915 onwards, after the sinking of Lusitania by German submarines, it was indeed engineers who were most conspicuously encouraged to contribute their expertise to the task. And we can see this in particular in the fields of aeronautics and anti-submarine measures. Thomas Edison received a very well publicized appointment to the Navy Consulting Board, which was established, said the Secretary of the Navy, to use the natural inventive genius of Americans to meet the new conditions of warfare. You can see Edison's right at the front here. He's the sort of man who's a completely dominant figure, and everybody else is sort of crowded around him. And the Navy Consulting Board basically equipped him out with a ship of his own to conduct experiments. And there he is with the crew of the USS Saturn. So there's a lot of emphasis upon bringing engineers, bringing inventors in. These are the people who are going to, their natural inventive genius is going to be key to winning the war. For leading American scientists, those with international reputations, like Robert Millikan, like George Ellery Hale, the director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, the approach of war presented an opportunity to persuade Americans of the social value of science, the sort of science that was not simply a handmaid to engineers like Edison, but which, by expanding fundamental knowledge of the physical world, could lay a wide foundation for all manner of unforeseen future discoveries and developments, as well as deepening the roots of human culture. And Hale was very, very believed to the very core of his being that scientists had to be cultured people as well. They had to be able to think about what they were doing in a broader human context. Hale's own research on the physics of the sun, he was a great solar physicist, really transformed the field in the 1890s. His work on the physics of the sun seemed about as distant from a field with practical applications as it was possible to go. This is, of course, well before we conceived of solar cells and those sort of things. But he was convinced that the sort of society that encouraged such work would also be the society best placed to confront the broader emergencies of the age. Now, he knew that interweaving the sciences with the business of government was a path fraught with professional and ethical hazards. He previously had enjoyed very close intellectual links with German researchers prior to the war, people working in German research universities. And he was horrified then to learn how readily some of them had accepted commissions in the Kaiser's cause, with the German chemist Fritz Haber overseeing the first use of poison gas on the Western Front in 1915. American men of science, enlisting in the defense of their nation, Hale thought, would have to maintain a moral compass and to try and conduct their inquiries in conformance with the highest experimental standards. Hale and Millikan were keen to establish the country's scientific elite as the locus, basically the locus of decisions, the kind of core people that you go to for decisions about how you deploy science to meet the needs of national security. Of course, the problem with that was that that's what they wanted. They were scientists. But it wasn't clear that the nation's governmental and military leaders would share those priorities. So in 1916, Hale approached President Wilson with a proposal for the establishment of what was called the National Research Council under the auspices of the National Academy of Sciences. And the National Research Council would coordinate the talents, Hale said, of academic scientists. Also try and pull in those working in those new industrial laboratories, and there were a lot of good scientists who were working in those laboratories, and then direct those scientists to try and address the most urgent problems of the war, the most urgent scientific or technological problems of the war. Wilson agreed. He agreed with Hale's proposal, and Hale then went off to Europe to go and swiftly assess how scientists in Britain and France were contributing to the war effort. But it was only in early 1917 that the US military actually invited the National Research Council to sort of lend its expertise. So for quite a long time, the National Research Council is sort of set up. It has all these sort of committees that Hale has established, but it hasn't been allowed into the sort of infrastructure of the military to sort of find out what is needed and to start lending advice. That only happened in early 1917 with the German resumption of unlimited submarine warfare. That's when the US military services formally requested to accept the assistance of the National Research Council. And the Research Council was very much dependent upon the military letting them in. It had some money of its own, but mostly from private sources. But it didn't have enough money to sort of sponsor strategic research projects on its own. It could only make itself useful, therefore, by persuading the military services, who were obviously much more flush with cash, that the council was a kind of conduit to scientific expertise that would be of genuine value to military research and development programs. And there were some suspicions across some of the military departments. There was a thought, for example, that academic scientists might just want to get a bit of money from the military and then run off and do their own experiments on what they were interested in. Or alternatively, that because they weren't very practical men, that term again, they might invent devices that were absolutely completely you just couldn't use them on the back in the circumstances of the battlefield. Many military leaders basically had a kind of preference for pulling scientists into their own military ambit rather than contracting military scientific tasks out to the universities. And in order to allay concerns about the NRC's priorities, Robert Millikan, who Hale persuaded to become the Council's Director of Research, took up a commission as a major in the Army Signal Corps. But it was also key that they prove their usefulness quickly. So with Hale, Millikan also moved quickly to draw scientists into discussions about the most critical problem facing the Allies, which was, of course, German submarine warfare. How do you detect, how do you work out where these submarines are? And this is really important because it threatened to limit the assistance that the Americans could actually give on the Western Front in terms of the vulnerabilities of the sort of traffic that's heading across the Atlantic in terms of men and materials and so on. There had been in the spring of 1917 the adoption of the convoy system, which is where you sort of send convoys across the Atlantic and you protect them. So instead of having lots of sort of individual ships going off, they cluster together, and that way you can defend them much more effectively. But there was still no reliable way of detecting the location of the U-boats underwater, or therefore of hunting them down. And so the National Research Council arranged for a team of physicists drawn from the universities to begin work at an experimental station in New London, Connecticut, And they liaised also with a team of industrial scientists based at a naval station in Nahant, Massachusetts. And this collaboration was very successful. It resulted in a series of significant refinements to some very rudimentary listening devices, underwater listening devices, that had been first developed by the British and the French. And by the spring of 1918, these devices, which allowed a patrol vessel to detect a submarine anywhere within a sort of vicinity or a surrounding area of about 300 square miles. So it's quite good in the sense that, you know, anywhere that's within about sort of 300, sort of 30 miles of you, you can detect where a submarine is in this sort of surrounding area of 300 square miles. And those devices started to be deployed on Allied ships. And so that allowed basically the Allies finally to get on the offensive against the U-boats, to score a number of kills, and critically also restricted the movements of those of others as well, and keep them confined in particular areas. So that's one significant contribution that was made by the NRC. Scientists pulled into military research by the NRC also made a major contribution in the development of ranging devices, which used the sound and the flashes that were emitted by artillery, enemy artillery batteries, to basically identify where these batteries were. So when an artillery gun such as this was fired, there's a sort of sound wave that results, and there's also a visible flash. And the idea was that could you use that sound? If you can monitor that sound, if you can monitor those flashes, and through very clever kind of ways triangulate them, you could work out where the artillery positions were. And if you could work out where the artillery positions were, you could land your own artillery to knock those out much more effectively. And certainly the ability of these German batteries, which were often hidden in areas miles behind the front lines, have played a very significant role in enforcing that stalemate that we know that existed on the Western Front for the last 3 years. The British and the Belgians and the French were already working on their ranging devices. And so when the Americans entered the war, they recruited, Hale recruited Augustus Trowbridge, who was a professor of physics at Princeton, to try and evaluate the various designs that the British, the Belgians, and the French developed, and in collaboration with the American Expeditionary Forces, decide which one was most practical for battlefield use. And he chose the British model, and Trowbridge arranged for 50 sets of these devices, suitably refined, to be produced by Western Electric, which is the manufacturing arm of AT&T. Again, you can see the kind of links that are taking place between universities and industrial laboratories. And he also opened a school to train Army engineers in these sort of ranging techniques. Trowbridge's team started mapping enemy artillery placements, which were being used in support of the German spring offensive in 1918. And he and his engineers also adapted the equipment so that it could move as the front lines moved. And this was particularly important if you think about what happens in the final 100 days of the war. When finally the stalemate breaks, the Allies are able to go on the offensive, and they can move this ranging equipment each time in order to knock out the enemy artillery as soon as it starts firing and prevent a consolidation of a sort of defensive position by the Germans. Trowbridge, who had been commissioned an army officer, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his work, much of which had been conducted necessarily close to the battlefield. Nobody could accuse Trowbridge of subsisting in an ivory tower. In contrast to the contributions made by scientists recruited through the NRC, none of the devices engineered by Edison during the war, with the aid of his lavish ship, which he then offered to the military, were ever adopted. Hale and Millikan basically approved their argument. In times of national emergency, scientists who had developed, through their peacetime work, a reservoir of fundamental knowledge could convert that knowledge into military applications, which were at least as effective as those developed by the practical men of Edison's ilk. But what next, after the armistice? The National Research Council, which had been, as we saw, something of a stepchild in 1916, had quickly incorporated itself over the course of the war into the multiple networks of the wartime state, linking the universities, industrial laboratories, private production facilities, the government and the military. And Hale certainly hoped that the council would now be accepted as a permanent feature of national life. But again, as I noted earlier, he's very keen to protect the principle of scientific. And there lay the rub. If money was to flow from the government into science through the NRC, politicians would want a say in how the money was spent. And Hale, for this elitist view, if you want, had very little faith that they would give, the politicians would give priority to fundamental research, even though the expertise that had been developed through such research had proved of such use in the war. He preferred then to protect the NRC's independence and seek funding from other sources, i.e. not the government. So in 1919, the NRC received support from the Rocket Foundation to fund postdoctoral fellowships in physics and chemistry. So this is the first such program, nationwide program of its kind in the United States. And the NRC was also granted an endowment by the Carnegie Corporation to pay for a permanent headquarters in Washington, D.C., and to help underwrite the costs of its future operation. So it was going to be permanent, but it wasn't going to be embedded in government. So there were good things there, but also what inevitably happened with demobilisation was that these kind of intricate voluntarist networks that the NRC had helped to create started to become undone. Millikan returned to the University of Chicago, subsequently then to be kind of pulled by Hale to help set up Caltech, which is now the highest rated university in the world, located right by the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena, California. So Millikan returned to his university, and of course other academic scientists who had been seconded to the military services also departed their posts. The Army and the Navy had sort of recognised the value of scientific research, but what they did was set up their own laboratories in this period. And although they hoped that civilian scientists might want to spend their summers coming in and sort of helping out and participating in the research being conducted there, for example, by joining the reserves and becoming reserve officers and therefore coming in during the summer to work in the Army laboratories or the Navy laboratories, actually the numbers who did so were fairly small. Basically, after the disruptions of war, everyone, it seemed, wanted to get back to their own, to pick up their own work. Now, was that something to regret? Well, in the wake of the Second World War and the escalation of tensions with the Soviet Union, the US military contracted out much more of its research to university laboratories. And through the late 40s, the 1950s, early 1960s, American university laboratories were able to upgrade their facilities, expand their research programs massively. But many historians have noted the payoff there, which is that, as Hale would have predicted, military money caused scientific research to skew towards questions of most interest to the military. Nuclear physics, quantum electronics, upper atmosphere research suited to the coming space age. Hale, as someone who had always regarded exchange with scholars overseas as critical to the advance of his own research, was also concerned to re-establish transnational scientific networks after the disruptions of the war. Just before the armistice, he travelled to London to encourage the scientists of the Allied nations to join together in a new International Research Council, the IRC. Although the Council would eventually invite neutral nations to participate, the French and the Belgians remained strongly opposed to German involvement. And that was a stance with which Hale, who had been appalled by what some German chemists had done during the war, he was very sort of sympathetic to the idea that the Germans couldn't automatically be invited back into sort of the transnational scientific community. But that view conflicted, the view of the Belgians and the French conflicted with the view of the Wilson administration that blame for the war was actually rather widely shared. And that if peace was to last, the German people, and that included its scientists, needed to be reintegrated fairly swiftly into the family of nations. So the International Research Council was established, but it was established both without the Germans and without formal support from the US President. The issue was a pressing intellectual one as well, a pressing one for intellectual reasons as well. After the war, physicists and astronomers finally had the time to wrestle with the implications of Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity, which had been presented to a rather distracted world in 1915. In 1990, a scientific expedition led by the British mathematician Arthur Eddington set out to West Africa to observe a total solar eclipse, which would provide an opportunity to check Einstein's prediction that starlight passing near the Sun was significantly deflected by the gravity of the Sun. And Edison's measurements corroborated Einstein's theory, with the New York Times in what I count as probably the best ever headline, announcing this on its front page. Light askew in all the heavens, men of science more or less agog over the results of observations. Einstein theory triumphed. Stars not where they seemed or were calculated to be, but nobody need worry. For Eddington, who was a Quaker, general relativity was not only transformative science overthrowing Newtonian physics, it also offered an opportunity to heal the wounds of war. Was Einstein really to be excluded from the international scientific community simply because he was German? After all, in 1914 he had refused to sign a petition defending Germany's militarism, to which many of his colleagues, including Fritz Haber and Max Planck, had lent their names. Einstein, as a Jew, had also experienced attacks on his work by German anti-Semites. Was he to be cut adrift to fight such battles alone? So general relativity, which conceived of the entire universe as woven into a four-dimensional fabric of space-time, and which recast gravity as the warping of that fabric by energy and mass, also worked to reconstitute the world of American science after the Great War in rather interesting ways. Einstein travelled 4 times to the United States between 1921 and 1933, and on each occasion he was greeted like a celebrity, feted as a man of unrivaled genius. Not many ordinary Americans claim to understand general relativity, but they understood at least the theory was important. Here was a very valuable, impractical man. Einstein enjoyed visiting George Hale at his solar observatory in California. Einstein returned to America a final time in October 1933 as a refugee from Nazism, taking up permanent residence in Princeton. Other Jewish scientists from Central Europe were to follow: Hans Bethe, Felix Bloch, Edward Teller, all of whom were to play a role in the Manhattan Project, an instance of government-sponsored science on another order of magnitude compared to the military research projects of 1917 to 1980, helping to develop a weapon, the atomic bomb, for which the United States would bring an end to the next World War. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kendrick. Single-handedly demolishing C.P. Sloan's belief that humanities and science can't talk to one another as disciplines. We do have a couple of minutes for questions, if anyone has any questions.
I'm intrigued by the idea that Moseley died on the discoverer of the electron, died as a common soldier in 1915 on the beach of Gallipoli. That was the British government's approach to science.
And I mean that is an example, that is a loss that people like Hale were very aware of. They were very, saddened, obviously, by the loss of this sort of great scientist in 1915, just as a sort of ordinary soldier in the war. And it did raise questions about what do you do with scientists? Are they allowed to have kind of special status and be removed from the draft, from conscription? And those were quite those were questions which were considered, and actually it made a sort of sign that although obviously some scientists were seconded as scientists in military services, in many ways the US military was quite reluctant to give special exemptions to scientists during the First World War. And so people like Hale, of course, took the view that you don't want to lose these people, but it was also important that scientists not be seen as sort of people who sort of remove themselves apart from the kind of ordinary obligations of people as well. Is that?
Just an observation, really. I am a research scientist, and I was part of a DTI team that went to the States about 15 years ago. And we had to visit the Walter Reed research facility, which was very strange because we met scientists wearing battle fatigues, and they tried to sell us as industrialists their cures for malaria. So there was a rather curious turnaround, and I think that still goes on today.
You would have noticed that I didn't really speak a great deal about medicine.
No.
In this. And yet there are undoubtedly contributions that are made by medical science to healthcare on the Western Front, and also to I think just talked about the influenza. Which is the great flu epidemic that sort of coincided at the end of the war into 1919 and knocks out more American troops than the Germans did. And so that's happening a lot. Not all of that is actually happening under the aegis of the National Research Council. It's responsible for some of that, but actually a lot of the innovations that have taken place as a result of American medicine being sort of brought over to the Western Front actually precede the war. So things like anesthetics and antiseptics. You have quite a number of American doctors who volunteer as neutrals to help with medical care on the Western Front, and they bring some of these techniques along with them.
Have you got time for sorry, but maybe to time just those last two?
Yes. Yes. So, following up that, in the interest of mine, the biological research, was there actually biological research encouraged or started as there was chemical research during the First World War?
That's a great question, and I have to say, I'm not sure what the answer is. I don't think so, and this is because, but I'm inferring from the lack of priority that was given to it in the years afterwards, where you get the Rockefeller Foundation giving money to physics and to chemistry, but not giving it to biology.
Can I just add to that? My uncle happened to be officer commanding Fort Detrick for a time, and he hinted that there was preliminary biological research going on to accompany research into chemistry and chemical weapons. Although Detrick didn't really start until the 1930s, which was the biological weapons establishment.
Mine was a very simple question. The amount of money that is given by the government these days in the States to scientific research, is that minimal or is it?
No, it's massive. Well, I mean, it depends on how you
My impression is that it's all private money.
No. I mean, there's of course, the Trump administration has started to pull back on some pieces of this, but I mean, the post-war era, there was a lot of military money going into fund research. So from the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, it's big. There was a kind of reaction against that to some extent as a result of the Vietnam War, there are restrictions placed upon the ability of the US military to kind of pump prime projects as a result of that. But the National Science Foundation, which draws a lot, it gets funded by the US government. It still exists. It's a civilian institution, and that's still a really significant funnel of cash.
Fantastic. Thank you ever so much once again, Kendrick. We've got about 40 odd minutes for lunch. So you can either convene in the bit where we've just been having